Morning, church, and morning to those of you who are joining us via live stream. Really appreciate your presence here with us this morning. Hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I'm sure it was a different one. It was for all of us, I think, having to practice some of the practices that we had to put in place and so on. But it was an enjoyable time, and I hope that if you couldn't be with your family physically, that maybe you could talk to them on the phone or Zoom or something like that and be able to see and share with them during this time. This morning, I want us to spend some time talking about dealing with the valleys that we encounter in life. I've called this surviving in the valleys of life. You're all aware of the fact, because it's been all over the news for the last several months now, that a lot of people in this country, a lot of them, are really having a hard time coping with the effects of the pandemic. Not just physically, but emotionally as well. Tremendous amount of depression being faced in this country today. And people are self-medicating in order to deal with it. Alcohol usage is way, way up. Drug usages of various kinds are way, way up as people try to deal with the emotional roller coaster that goes with a pandemic like this, and loss of salary, loss of their business, separation from their families, all the different things that go with this pandemic. Fact of the matter is that life has its peaks and its valleys, right? And we're definitely, I think, dealing with one of the deeper troughs I've seen in my lifetime, in the valley that we're kind of having to slog our way through right now. And so I want to make some observations about valleys this morning, the valleys that we face in our lives. And the first one is that these valleys are indeed unavoidable. And please don't take that as being cynical. I'm not being cynical at all. That's just realistic. It's the way it is. Eliphaz, in the book of Job, makes this statement: "Yet man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward." The fact of the matter is that all of us are going to have difficulties in our lives. And those difficulties aren't necessarily punishments. Those difficulties are not necessarily consequences of mistakes that we've made in our lives. The fact of the matter is that things happen. And when they do, sometimes we end up finding ourselves in the middle of a valley. Now, you know, as settlers went west 150 years ago, as they traveled west toward California, they had to cross mountain ranges, right? And you hear a lot about, well, we got to find a pass to get through the mountain ranges. But if you actually read what they wrote about, one of the things they really struggled with were the valleys. Because some of those valleys could be really difficult. For instance, in Southern California, there's one valley, and what's it called? Death Valley. For a good reason. Because a lot of people died trying to go across that valley and facing the extremes that it presented. Valleys are going to come in our lives. They are inevitable. They're unavoidable. The question is not if those valleys are going to come. It's when they come, how are we going to face them? How are we going to deal with them? The writer of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 2, makes a powerful point in talking about Jesus. Now remember, brothers and sisters, here is the perfect individual. Here is the one, literally the one, who lived his life and never made a mistake, never committed a sin, never did the wrong thing, ever. And yet, as Jim just pointed out to us in the devotional talk, look at what he went through at the crucifixion and prior to it. Now, the writer of Hebrews says a couple of things in chapter 2 that I want us to think about in light of the fact that these valleys that we're going to face are unavoidable. First of all, in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, for it was fitting that he, and there it's speaking of the Father, that he for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation, that's Jesus, what? Perfect through suffering. Now the word perfect, please understand, can and often should be rendered probably better as complete rather than perfect. Complete. Jesus was made complete through suffering. Later on, verse 17, the writer goes on to say, therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. And if one of those respects is that we have to deal with valleys in our lives, so did he. Isaiah chapter 53, that famous prophecy of the coming of Messiah. How is Messiah described there? As a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. This one who lived a perfect life had some really tough valleys that he had to walk through. Think about the valley, for instance, of rejection. You really want the job. You've done everything you could to be considered for the job. You think the interview went well. You feel this close to getting the job, and you don't get it. It's no fun, is it? Can kick you right down in the valley for a while, can't it? She's the one. You've fallen head over heels for her. You want her to be the one in your life. She says, yeah, I don't think so. You're rejected. That hurts. Jesus knew, brothers and sisters, I want you to think about this. Man, he knew what it meant to be rejected. He comes to his own hometown. He comes back to Nazareth. And what do? They're going to drag him out of town and throw him off a cliff. The people he grew up with. In John 7, his own brothers don't even believe in him. I mean, John just flat tells you that's how they felt about him at that point. Their attitude changed later, but at that point, you talk about rejection. You talk about how that had to hurt. Back in chapter 6, he's fed 5,000 people. 5,000 people. Done this amazing miracle. People have chased him across the Sea of Galilee to the other side. And when they get over there, here they come to him, and they're wanting him to do it again. Feed us again. Feed us again. And what's he say? Oh, you just don't get it, do you? I'm not about feeding you physical bread. I'm about feeding you me. It's my body and it's my blood that's going to give you sustenance. That's what's going to allow you to live ultimately. And their response to that is what? The text says, man, they leave in droves. Ouch. How do you suppose he felt? All these people just, well, if you're not going to do for me what I think you ought to do, I'm gone. In fact, he turns to his own apostles, remember? Are you going to leave me too? He knew the valley of rejection. I think even worse than that, he knew the valley of being hated. I mean, hated. Remember John chapter 11, after he is called to go and heal Lazarus, and he waits a few days before he goes, his apostles are all, mixed emotions about this. Thomas is like, well, let's go with him and die with him. I mean, they know that if they get back to the hot bed of the people who really hate him, there's an excellent possibility if they kill him, they'll kill those apostles too. Now this isn't just some kind of latent, I really don't like you kind of a thing. No, this is bitter envy. This is plotting to murder. That's what this is. Now I want you to think about this. The last few days of his life, yeah, there's a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. There is. And he comes riding in, and these people are praising him and laying palms down before him and all this kind of thing, celebrating his arrival. But everywhere he goes for the next few days, every time he speaks, who's standing there glaring at him with hate-filled eyes? Pharisees and Sadducees, just listening and waiting for the opportunity to catch him in some kind of contradiction, to embarrass him in some way. And he knows the whole time they're plotting not just to embarrass him, not just to contradict him, but to kill him. Does he know the valley of hatred? He does. In fact, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but it dawned on me as I was writing on this. You know where he spent several of the last hours of his life? He spends them at Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane. That garden sits on the slopes of the valley of Kidron. That's where that garden is. The valley through which the blood of all those sacrificial lambs flow, associated with the Passover. I think symbolically it's interesting, isn't it, that he's in a valley just hours before his death. The fact of the matter is, in all of our lives, financial setbacks are going to come, kid problems are going to occur, health difficulties are going to arise. It's just the way it is. Valleys are going to come into our lives. They're unavoidable. They're part of the human experience. Jesus is not made complete until he faces what we face in this life. Secondly, these valleys are very unpredictable. Proverbs 27 verse 1. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring, the wise king says. And that's right. We don't know, do we, what a day may bring. Do you remember? I do. Conversations a year ago now. Man, aren't you glad 2019 is about to come to an end? Hadn't this been quite a year with a 500-year flood? Man, look at all we've been through. Boy, I'm looking forward to 2020. Huh? Weren't we? We absolutely were. Man, I heard it over and over again, and I was saying it too. I'm glad this year is over. Boy, 2020 can't be as bad as 2019. So much for our prognostication, right? We don't know what the valleys are or when the valleys are going to come. We just know there are going to be valleys. And because they're unpredictable, because we don't know when they're going to come, we need to be ready for them and accept they're going to be here. I was sitting in my office at Sunset when I was preaching there, and a dear friend of mine, David Shelburne, came in. David and I were good friends. We played golf together, goofed around together. He went with me when we went to Israel and Egypt. He worked for a time at Sunset with the university program there. I love David. Had a wife, young family, and David said, Dan, I don't feel good. I'm really tired. He called football and he said, I can't get up and down the field like I want to. Something going on. Now he's at this time late 40s. I said, Dave, man, you need to go see a doctor. Something's going on, bud. This is not right. And so he went to the doctor. And I was sitting there when they did the test on David and came back and said, Mr. Shelburne, you've got stage 4 colon cancer. David lived for about 15, 16 months after that diagnosis. We moved here in September. He died, I believe, in November of the year we moved here. You never met anybody more full of life, who enjoyed life more, had more fun than David Shelburne. And the last thing on David Shelburne's list, I'm sure, of plans for his life was, I'm going to die of stage 4 colon cancer before my kids ever get close to grown up. But that's what happened. We don't know what tomorrow holds. We don't know the valleys that are come our way. It really came home to me this week. I was listening to Rush Limbaugh going home at noon. I think it was on Wednesday. And Limbaugh usually doesn't do a show around Thanksgiving, but he was doing the show. And at the end of the show, Limbaugh basically said goodbye. Thank you and goodbye. Limbaugh has stage 4 lung cancer. Treatments aren't working. He knows he doesn't have much time. This is a guy who makes tens of millions of dollars a year, has been the biggest thing in talk radio forever. And he's fixing to go through the valley of the shadow of death, and he knows it. Who could have predicted that? Who knew that? Nobody. But that's life. Life has valleys. And those valleys are unavoidable, and those valleys are unpredictable. And we need to be cognizant of that. And again, I don't think that's being cynical or anything like that. I think it's just recognizing that's the way it is. That's the truth. And spiritually and emotionally, we need to be prepared for when the valleys come, because they're going to come. Now, thank God, I do believe these valleys are temporary. 1 Peter 5, verse 10, and the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered for a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. What's Peter talking about? Man, he's talking about a valley of persecution, valley of difficulty. And he says, some of you are going to have to suffer for a while. We all know folks who have suffered for more than a little while. I know dear people who have suffered for years of ongoing, constant pain. And I admire them for their fortitude and their courage and their faith in facing the physical difficulties that they faced. It's been a long, deep valley, but listen to Peter, and I believe it's true. It's only temporary. Because when you put it in the context of eternity, it's like that. Now, man, it doesn't seem like that at the time. But in the ultimate scheme of things, it's only temporary. I was listening to an older preacher years ago, and I've never forgotten this. He was talking about wilderness experience, but valleys would hold equally true. About the fact that all of us at times are going to find ourselves in the wilderness, and we will. We're going to find ourselves in dry times and dry places. We will. It's a fact. And all kinds of circumstances can come about to put us there, but if you've lived any time at all, you've been there. You've been in one of those valleys. And he said, you know what I have found and what I firmly believe is that if you'll be faithful in the wilderness, understand that the rains will come. That drought, that wilderness will not last forever. The rains will come. And they will. They will. They do. I've seen it in my life. You've seen it in your life. Hang in there. It's only temporary. Be faithful. And the rains will come. Because as difficult as those valleys can be, they are only temporary. And do we have one day a mountaintop to look forward to? Last of the 4 points. Always remember that these valleys have a purpose. There's a reason for them. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes, even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine. It may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. There are things that are given to us to refine us, purify us, strengthen us, ultimately to make us better. And those often are valleys. Valleys that we have to walk through, valleys that test us right down to the very core of our being. But important, life-changing, life-shaping experiences. I'm always fascinated with the story of Jacob. The Jacob that leaves his daddy's house, kind of kicked out and sent up to Syria. And the Jacob that comes back from Syria after he's been kicked around and abused and taken advantage of by Laban for 20 years are two different Jacobs. Jacob the shyster, Jacob the wise guy, Jacob the manipulator is not the Jacob that comes back down out of Syria, out of that valley 20 years later. It's a different Jacob who wrestles with God on the way back home. Over and over again, you see individuals transformed by the experience that they have. Moses, 40 years, he's in Egypt. He is royalty. It really is, I think, difficult for us to conceptualize, to understand the wealth that surrounded that man, the power that he had as a prince of Egypt. And he goes from being a prince of Egypt to living out in the desert wilderness for 40 years. 40 years, herding sheep. This guy who probably ate off gold plates with gold forks, who had whatever he wanted, and now he's out herding sheep for 40 years. But why is he in that valley? Because he's fixing to lead God's people for the next 40 years. And he's going to lead them through that wilderness, and he's going to know that wilderness like the back of his hand. He's being prepared, made ready as he moves through that valley. Old brother I knew had his knees replaced, and he did super well. I mean, I was amazed at how quickly he seemed to recover from having his knees replaced. And I asked him, Kenneth, why? And he said, Dan, when you have bone on bone, and he said, I had bone on bone in both knees. He said, it hurts. It really hurts. And after that surgery, it hurt. It really hurt. But it didn't hurt any worse than it did before. And listen to him. He said, before I was hurting and I wasn't getting any better. Now I'm hurting and I'm getting better. I'm getting better. Sometimes we got to hurt to get better, don't we? Hurting can have a purpose. Hurting can sometimes be a blessing. You got to put it in perspective, just like he did. What should be our attitude in the valleys? Well, you got to go to Psalm 23, verse 4, don't you? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. What's this tell us? Well, it tells us we will walk through the valley. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. All of us sooner or later are going to walk through that valley, aren't we? We are. We'll walk through it. It's going to be a part of our experience. Personally, we're going to walk through it with loved ones and family members and friends and others. We're going to walk through it. We're going to walk through the valley. Again, back to what I said earlier. These valleys are inevitable. They're going to happen. Okay? We're going to have to walk through that valley. Here's the thing. We can walk through that valley fearing no evil. Unafraid. Hope you've had an opportunity to listen to Steve's lessons on Wednesday night, because that's one of the things he's just talked about, is living the Christian life without fear. Reasons why we don't need to be afraid. To live as do those who have no hope. We see a world petrified by the virus, because in their minds this world's all there is. Man, when you're dead, it's over. They're done. There's no more. And you see, it's very difficult for them to understand the Christian perspective that says, I love this life, but if I die, that's just fine. Because I've got another better life to look forward to. And so we can walk through that valley and we don't have to be afraid, because we know the conqueror. We know the overcomer. We can trust in God's presence and His protection. His rod and His staff, they comfort us, and they do. And so as we deal with the valleys of this life, just keep in mind how really blessed we are. Not that we're going to dodge the valleys or escape the valleys, because we're not. But in the end, when we travel through that last valley, that valley of the shadow of death, it's not going to be trudging through with our heads hung down, defeated and worn out in the end. It's going to be with face raised and eyes looking ahead and a big smile on our face, because of what we're fixing to enjoy and what we're fixing to see and the blessings that are going to be ours. That ultimate valley is going to be a valley of triumph for you and for me. This morning, if we can help you in your walk through these valleys, in your walk through this life, if you're ready to begin that walk with Jesus, if you're ready to confess His name and put Him on in baptism, if we can help you in any way, please come while we stand and sing.